December 1944. Over the quiet towns of southern England, a strange sound rolled across the sky, not the deep thunder of a bomber, nor the slicing roar of a fighter. This was different. It was a low, stuttering buzz, like an angry swarm of mechanical bees. People froze when they heard it. They didn't need to ask what it was. The dreaded V-1 flying bomb was on its way. Mothers clutched their children, old men ducked behind doorways, and soldiers on leave pressed themselves flat against walls, listening in terror. As long as the buzzing continued, there was still hope. But then, suddenly, silence. The engine had cut out. That meant the bomb was falling. And in a matter of seconds, an entire street could vanish in a blinding explosion. The Germans called it their Vergeltungswaffe 1, weapon of vengeance 1. To Hitler, it was the miracle that would break Britain's will to fight. Launched from hidden ramps across northern France, each V-1 carried nearly a ton of high explosive and could travel more than 150 miles. It didn't need a pilot. It didn't need precision. Its mission was simple: terror. In London, people nicknamed them buzz bombs or doodlebugs. Between June and August 1944, more than 9,000 were fired across the Channel. Thousands of civilians were killed, and whole neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Night after night, London burned, while Churchill fumed and demanded results. But what the Germans didn't know, what they could never have imagined, was that the Allies were preparing a secret weapon of their own. A weapon so advanced, so closely guarded, that its existence was classified above even the atomic bomb. And soon, it would turn the skies of Europe into a death trap for Hitler's vengeance weapons. By the summer of 1944, Nazi Germany was crumbling. The Allies had stormed ashore in Normandy, the Red Army was smashing through the Eastern Front, and Hitler's once invincible Reich was being squeezed from both sides. But inside the Führer bunker, Hitler clung to a single hope: his so-called Wunderwaffen, the miracle weapons that he believed could reverse his fading fortunes. At the top of this list stood the V-1 flying bomb. To the German High Command, the weapon was revolutionary. It was cheap to build, easy to launch, and terrifying to the enemy. From their perspective, every V-1 that reached London was a victory, not for its military impact, but for the psychological damage it inflicted. The bombs weren't meant to win battles on the ground. They were designed to break the spirit of a nation. And in some ways, it worked. The British public lived under constant tension. Each night, the skyline lit up with fiery explosions. Rescue workers clawed through smoking ruins, searching for survivors. Families huddled in shelters, praying the next doodlebug wouldn't fall on their street. Every silence after a buzz became unbearable. The fear was relentless. Churchill himself described the campaign as the most frightful assault on civilian morale since the Blitz of 1940. Yet even as Londoners endured the nightmare, the Germans celebrated. In their propaganda, the V-1 was paraded as proof that Germany still had the power to strike back. But beneath the swagger, a grim truth lingered. The V-1 was fast, over 400 miles per hour, but not unstoppable. Fighter pilots discovered they could sometimes intercept them, even nudging them off course with their wingtips. Anti-aircraft guns filled the skies with flak, but with little success. For every bomb destroyed, far too many slipped through. The system wasn't working. Churchill demanded an answer. Britain couldn't endure a war of terror forever. Something new was needed. Something that could change the odds overnight. What no one outside the highest Allied command realized was that a secret weapon had already been built, one so advanced that it would transform anti-aircraft warfare forever. Hidden deep inside secret laboratories across the United States, scientists had been working on a device so advanced it bordered on science fiction. Officially, it was called the VT fuse, short for variable time fuse. To soldiers, it would later be known simply as the proximity fuse. Before this invention, anti-aircraft fire was more about luck than skill. Gunners had to guess the height, speed, and direction of an enemy aircraft, set a timer on the shell, and hope it exploded close enough to do damage. In practice, it often took thousands of rounds to bring down a single target. Against something as small and fast as a V-1, the odds were miserable.
The proximity fuse changed everything.
Inside its small steel shell was a miniature radio transmitter and receiver, a marvel of miniaturization for the 1940s. When the fuse detected it was near a solid object, like an airplane or flying bomb, it triggered the explosive at precisely the right moment.
No more guessing. No more wasted fire.
The shells could now explode at the perfect distance, turning near misses into direct hits. It was a triumph of American science and industry. The fuse was so sensitive, so effective, that General George Marshall later called it one of the most important developments of the entire war. Yet the secret was guarded more tightly than the Manhattan Project. Soldiers using the shells were told almost nothing. If one were captured, German scientists might unravel its design, and that was unthinkable. When the V1 campaign began, the British were desperate. They needed a miracle to protect London. And the Americans were about to deliver one. In August 1944, shipments of the proximity fuse arrived, ready to be tested in the crucible of war. The skies over Europe would never be the same again. The summer of 1944 was a season of fire and fear. Londoners had already endured years of bombing, but the V1 campaign was different. These flying bombs came day and night, unpredictable and terrifying. Anti-aircraft crews across southern England worked until their hands blistered, eyes bloodshot from staring at the skies, firing thousands of shells with little effect. Each failure meant more homes destroyed, more families shattered. Then, in mid-August, the first shipments of American-made proximity fuses quietly reached British gun batteries. The technology was so secret that crates arrived under armed guard, with orders sealed until the last possible moment. Even the gunners themselves didn't fully understand what they were about to use. All they were told was simple: load these. Fire as directed. And watch. On the night of August 6th, German launch sites roared to life. Dozens of V1s streaked toward London, their engines buzzing like mechanical hornets.
Searchlight cut through the dark.
Anti-aircraft crews braced themselves, hearts pounding as they loaded the new shells. The first salvo went up.
Burst of fire lit the night sky.
Then, something incredible happened. Instead of passing harmlessly by, explosions ripped directly into the V1s. One by one, the bombs disintegrated in midair, fiery wreckage raining down far from their targets. Cheers erupted from the gun pits. For the first time, the defenders weren't powerless. They had teeth. Word spread quickly. Within days, reports confirmed the unthinkable. Entire batteries were now shooting down over 80% of incoming V1s. In some sectors, the kill rate reached levels once thought impossible. Civilians could finally sleep without constant dread. The miracle had arrived. But in Berlin, the German high command was left baffled. Their unstoppable weapons were falling like flies, and no one knew why. For the Allies, the results were nothing short of revolutionary. Before the proximity fuse, bringing down a single V1 had been a costly gamble. Gunners needed nearly 2,500 shells to destroy just one flying bomb. With the new technology, the number dropped to fewer than 100. Suddenly, Allied defenses were no longer straining against impossible odds. They were winning. Londoners felt the change almost instantly. The nightly terror began to fade. Where once the skies were filled with the distant thunder of explosions, now they were filled with cheers as defenders scored visible kills. Newspapers, bound by censorship, couldn't explain why casualties were dropping. But civilians sensed that something had shifted. For the first time in years, hope returned. To German commanders, however, the picture made no sense. They launched thousands of V1s, confident their vengeance weapons would grind British morale into dust. But the weapons were falling short of their goal. Streets were still hit, yes, but not in the numbers required to change the war. The Reich's great gamble was unraveling, and they couldn't understand how. The truth remained locked away in Allied secrecy. So valuable was the fuse that soldiers were ordered, under threat of court-martial, never to let a single unexploded shell fall into enemy hands. In fact, the fear of discovery was so great that the fuses were initially banned from use over land combat, in case fragments were recovered. Only when the V1 threat became unbearable did Churchill himself insist, "We must risk it. London must be saved." The gamble paid off. By late summer 1944, British skies were no longer dominated by Hitler's buzz bombs. Instead, they were a proving ground for the weapon the world wasn't allowed to know existed. Behind the miracle in the skies was one of the most ambitious and expensive projects of the entire war. The proximity fuse program cost over $1 billion, more than the Manhattan Project in today's money. Yet unlike the atomic bomb, it remained hidden in the shadows, its existence whispered only among the highest levels of Allied command. Over 80,000 workers in 110 factories across America labored to produce the delicate electronic guts of the fuse. Tiny radio transmitters, vacuum tubes no bigger than a thumb, batteries that could survive the shock of being fired from a cannon. Each piece was a marvel of engineering. To protect the secret, workers were often told they were building parts for radios or aircraft equipment. Few had any idea they were manufacturing one of the most decisive weapons of the war. The scale was staggering. By 1945, the United States had produced more than 22 million fuses, each costing just $18 to make. They rolled off assembly lines like bullets, proof that American industry could mass-produce even the most advanced electronics. Germany, with its handcrafted approach to technology, never stood a chance of catching up. And yet, the secrecy was so intense that even many soldiers using the fuses didn't fully understand them. Orders were strict: don't tamper, don't ask questions, just fire. If a shell misfired, it was to be destroyed immediately. If one fell unexploded, recovery teams raced to secure it before the enemy could. The fear of German scientists unlocking the secret was constant. But they never did. Despite thousands of interrogations after the war, German officers admitted they had no clue why their weapons were failing. The secret had been kept. And that secrecy was as decisive as the invention itself. August 18, 1944, became a turning point in the Battle of the V-weapons. That morning, German launch sites in northern France unleashed wave after wave of V-1 flying bombs towards southern England. The Reich expected devastation. Instead, it got disaster. British anti-aircraft batteries, now armed almost entirely with proximity fuses, opened fire. The skies lit up with bursts of fire that seemed to anticipate the V-1's every move. The effect was astonishing. Out of hundreds of incoming bombs, more than 82% were destroyed before reaching their targets. Whole waves were wiped out in minutes. In London, families huddled in shelters braced for the usual thunder of detonations. But on that day, the silence stretched on. Fewer explosions reached the city, fewer buildings collapsed, fewer funerals followed. Without realizing it, civilians were witnessing one of the greatest single-day defensive victories of the war. The soldiers manning the guns could scarcely believe it themselves. For years, they had fought with little more than guesswork, hoping a lucky burst might bring down a bomber. Now, with every shell, they watched Hitler's terror weapons vanish in fireballs overhead. Veterans later recalled the sense of awe, describing it as if the guns had suddenly found eyes. In Berlin, reports arrived that shook the German high command. Their wonder weapon, the machine they had promised would save the Reich, was failing. But no one could explain how. Engineers checked the designs, adjusted flight paths, even speculated about sabotage. Still, the losses mounted. That day revealed a hard truth. Germany's last gamble at the Channel had been broken, not by a new army or a massive fleet, but by a piece of American technology no larger than a man's fist. The astonishing success of the VT fuse came with a heavy burden: secrecy. The Allies knew if the Germans discovered how it worked, they could adapt instantly, reinforcing the V1 skin with wire mesh, installing jamming devices, or even copying the fuse for their own weapons. So, while British gunners celebrated their newfound accuracy, official reports were carefully worded. Newspapers were told only that improvements in gunnery were paying off. The public had no idea why the skies suddenly seemed safer. Even many frontline soldiers never knew the secret behind their shells. General Eisenhower himself issued orders: any unexploded VT fuse round must be recovered at all costs. If one fell into enemy hands intact, it could undo years of scientific progress. Units were trained to risk their lives retrieving dud shells before the Germans could get to them. Some men joked that the fuse was worth more than we were. Behind the scenes, German intelligence struggled to solve the mystery. Reports described Allied gunners destroying bombs with almost supernatural precision. Rumors spread among Luftwaffe crews that the Allies had developed radio-guided shells or invisible fighter patrols. Nobody guessed the truth: a tiny electronic brain in each shell, waiting to sense its target. Secrecy was so strict that when Churchill visited an anti-aircraft site, the crew demonstrated their guns but were forbidden to explain why they were suddenly so effective. The Prime Minister, ever sharp, smiled knowingly but said nothing. For the Allies, the message was clear: victory in the skies depended not only on technology, but on keeping the enemy blind to how it worked. By late summer 1944, German commanders were desperate. The V1 campaign, once touted as Hitler's vengeance miracle, was collapsing before their eyes. Hundreds of flying bombs never made it past the channel. The ones that did were swatted from the skies in record numbers. Luftwaffe engineers scrambled for answers. They thickened the V-1 steel skin, only to discover it barely mattered. The proximity fuses still detonated at just the right distance. They tried flying at lower altitudes, hoping to sneak beneath radar coverage. But this only made the bombs easier for guns and fighters to reach. Even pilots of the Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter, Germany's last hope, muttered that defending against VT-fused guns was hopeless. One officer recorded in his diary, "The enemy artillery now possesses devilish accuracy. It is as though the shells have eyes." Meanwhile, German intelligence pieced together disturbing rumors. Agents in occupied France whispered about radio magic shells and electric bullets. One captured V-1 pilot swore he saw shells curve unnaturally, bursting exactly as they passed his wing. He called it witchcraft. None of them were far from the truth. The Allies' guarded secret meant Germany could only guess, and guessing wasn't enough. Factories kept churning out V-1s, but the weapon once meant to terrorize London was being outpaced by science. For the first time, Hitler's wonder weapon was failing not because of numbers, but because of something far deadlier: American and British ingenuity wrapped in a fuse no bigger than a fist. By August 1944, Londoners noticed something strange. The dreaded wail of the V-1 buzz bomb, once a daily nightmare, was growing rarer. Where once hundreds had streaked overhead, now only a trickle broke through. People who had spent months diving for cover at the cut of an engine finally dared to stand in the open, watching anti-aircraft shells burst in perfect, deadly timing. Newspapers cautiously reported remarkable gunnery successes. What they couldn't say, what almost no civilian knew, was that the success came from the most secret invention of the war. Behind every perfect mid-air explosion was a proximity fuse, a tiny electronic brain that made every near miss into a direct kill. The numbers told the story. In June, only 9% of V-1s were destroyed. By July, it climbed to 40%. But in August, after mass deployment of VT fuses, the success rate rocketed to 82% in a single day. For the first time, the defenders of London had turned the tables. German commanders were stunned. They doubled launch sites, sped up production, even forced slave laborers to work around the clock. But no matter how many V-1s they launched, most never reached their targets. Hitler's vengeance weapon was bleeding Germany's dwindling resources dry. One British officer summed it up perfectly: the secret fuse did not just save London. It broke the back of the V-1 offensive. The war of terror had shifted, and the German people would soon learn that vengeance weapons could not stop defeat. To the Allies, the proximity fuse was not just a weapon, it was a treasure. General George Marshall called it second only to the atomic bomb in importance. That wasn't an exaggeration. If the Germans discovered its secret, they might copy it, deploy it against Allied bombers, or even against the invasion fleets that crossed the Channel. So the fuse program was wrapped in a cloak of secrecy as tight as the Manhattan Project. Documents were stamped top secret, handle with extreme caution. Crews were ordered, if captured, destroy at all costs. If that is impossible, die with it. That was how critical the device was. In fact, American officers feared that even the fragments of a downed fuse could betray its design. Orders went out that any dud shells had to be recovered at once, even under enemy fire. Entire squads risked their lives to retrieve shattered pieces before German intelligence could find them. But here's the shocking twist: despite tens of millions of fuses fired in Europe, the Germans never learned how they worked. They saw their V-1s vanish from the sky, but not once did they realize the secret was inside the shells, not in the gunners. German scientists dismissed the idea as impossible. That mistake, that fatal underestimation, kept the skies over London safe. The Allies had handed their gunners the most advanced electronic weapon of the war, and the enemy never even knew it existed. In August 1944, the Luftwaffe command was desperate. Their V-1 revenge weapon campaign was supposed to break London's spirit. At first, hundreds of the flying bombs got through. But then suddenly, day by day, their success rate collapsed. Instead of striking the city, their V-1s were vanishing in fireballs mid-air. German engineers scratched their heads. Reports poured in from pilots and civilians. The enemy gunners have become superhuman. Their aim is perfect. At first, commanders assumed the British had doubled their anti-aircraft guns. Others believed radar must have been upgraded. But even doubling the guns or refining radar couldn't explain what was happening. The statistics were damning. The V-1 had been designed to overwhelm defenses with sheer numbers. Yet in one day, 82% were shot down. The Luftwaffe's own analysts admitted privately, the weapon's effectiveness is greatly reduced. Our calculations are no longer valid. What none of them realized was that American scientists had hidden a radio brain inside each shell. The gunners didn't need perfect aim anymore. A near miss was now a kill. To the Germans, it looked like a miracle of accuracy. To the Allies, it was science, mass production, and secrecy working together. After the war, when captured German scientists were finally shown the proximity fuse, their reactions were disbelief. One stunned engineer reportedly muttered, "If we had known this existed, we never would have launched the V-1 campaign." It was not British gunners who had suddenly become superhuman, it was their shells. And that truth had stayed invisible until it was too late. The proximity fuse wasn't just a scientific breakthrough, it was an industrial miracle. Creating a tiny rugged radio that could survive being fired from a cannon at 20,000 Gs of force was only half the challenge. The other half was building it in numbers large enough to change the war. And this is where America's strength came alive. In secret contracts spread across 110 factories and 80,000 workers, the United States produced the fuse not by the hundreds, but by the millions. Over 22 million units were made, each one a masterpiece of miniaturized electronics, assembled by workers who didn't even know what they were building. The cost was staggering, more than $1 billion wartime dollars. Each fuse cost about $18 to manufacture, more than the artillery shells they were fitted into. But what they delivered was priceless. Before the fuse, gunners needed 2,500 shells to bring down a single aircraft or flying bomb. With the fuse, it took just 100. Factories worked around the clock, entire supply chains redirected to feed the secret program. Radios, tubes, wiring, and batteries, all miniaturized, all hardened to withstand shock. It was an assembly line of hidden power. To the Germans, the Allies seemed to have developed an unstoppable accuracy. What they didn't see was the invisible radio pulse whispering through the sky, detonating shells with deadly precision. The Manhattan Project built the bomb. But the proximity fuse built victory one shell at a time, mass-produced, invisible, and unstoppable. For most of the war, the proximity fuse was guarded under tighter secrecy than even the atomic bomb. Soldiers were told never to let one fall into enemy hands. If a dud landed, recovery squads raced to destroy it before German engineers could examine the tiny, glass tubes and copper wiring hidden inside. Even the gunners firing them rarely understood the science at work. To them it was magic, shells that exploded at just the right moment, tearing through V-1s and enemy aircraft with uncanny precision. Then, in late 1944, with Hitler's vengeance campaign collapsing and Allied victory on the horizon, Winston Churchill finally lifted the veil. Addressing Parliament, he declared, "It would be wrong to withhold from Parliament any longer a knowledge of what is, without doubt, the most important new invention of the war." He was speaking of the proximity fuse. Churchill explained how this small, unassuming device had transformed the defense of Britain, saved London from destruction, and given Allied troops in the field a weapon of unmatched power. For months, the German V-1s had terrorized the skies. Now, thanks to the fuse, more than 82% were being shot down before reaching their targets. The revelation stunned even Britain's own politicians, many of whom had no idea such a device existed. To the public, it was as if a hidden shield had been raised over their cities. To Germany, it was a humiliating reminder of how far behind they truly were in the race of technology. For the first time, the world knew the truth. The buzz bombs hadn't been stopped by luck, or by some new fighter plane. They had been stopped by science, by an invisible spark inside a shell, born in secret labs, mass-produced in silence, and revealed only when victory was certain. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in 1945, the proximity fuse stood as one of the quiet giants of Allied victory. It had never been splashed across headlines like the atomic bomb. It wasn't as romanticized as the Spitfire or the Sherman tank. Yet, for soldiers, sailors, and civilians, it was every bit as decisive. In the Pacific, the fuse had already proven itself against Japanese kamikazes, detonating shells in the exact instant needed to destroy planes diving at U.S. warships. On land, It had been used in artillery barrages, turning forests into killing fields by bursting shells above entrenched enemy troops. And in Europe, it had made the skies over London survivable again, cutting Hitler's vengeance weapons out of the air before they could do their worst. By war's end, over 22 million fuses had been produced in American factories. They had been handled by 80,000 workers, across 110 plants, and shipped by the thousands to every theater of war. Each one cost just $18 to make, yet saved countless lives and immeasurable damage. For Germany, the most haunting truth was this: they never fully understood why their V1s were failing. Despite interrogations, intelligence efforts, and even recovered dud shells, the miniature radio miracle remained beyond their grasp. Their wonder weapons had been undone by something too small to see, too advanced to copy, and too secret to imagine. In the years after 1945, the proximity fuse became the foundation of modern munitions, a stepping stone to missiles, smart bombs, and guided rockets. But its true legacy was in showing the world that science, not just steel and fire, would decide the future of war. It was a weapon that left no statue, no monument, no iconic silhouette. Yet it quietly saved London, broke Hitler's terror campaign, and changed forever the way nations fought. The war had many heroes. The proximity fuse was one of the silent ones.